Thomas Albright had built a life that many envied. On Wall Street, he was known as a shrewd financier, a man who could see opportunities before anyone else. His instincts and bold decisions earned him not only wealth, but also deep respect in powerful financial circles. Away from the chaos of trading floors, his sanctuary was the Hamptons. There, he and his wife, Vanessa Hale, owned a mansion that stretched across 3 acres with manicured gardens, a private pool, and rooms filled with rare art and antiques. To friends and colleagues, Thomas seemed untouchable, wealthy, respected, and blessed with a beautiful family. But beneath the glossy surface, the truth was far more complicated. The marriage between Thomas and Vanessa had begun to crumble. Vanessa, though admired for her beauty and creativity, often felt suffocated in her husband's shadow. She pursued painting and artistic projects, but Thomas dismissed her work as trivial. Resentments grew like cracks in fine glass. Arguments turned bitter, and whispers of infidelity and betrayal crept into their social circles. By the late 1990s, divorce was no longer just a possibility, it was inevitable. The stakes were enormous. Millions of dollars in property investments, and the custody of their children. The Hamptons mansion itself became the ultimate prize, not just for wealth, but for victory. Friends recalled Thomas once telling Vanessa with cold certainty, "You will never take what I built." It was during this turbulent time that Vanessa met Michael Russo. Russo was everything Thomas was not. Where Thomas was refined, disciplined, and successful, Russo was brash, unpredictable, and rough around the edges. He had a criminal record, with charges of theft and fraud, and a reputation for violence. Yet Vanessa was drawn to him. What began as a professional encounter quickly became something far more dangerous. Soon, Russo was no longer just an electrician working on one of Vanessa's properties. He slipped into her life at alarming speed. Neighbors remembered seeing him driving her car, answering her phone, and even giving orders to her children. To David and Emily, their mother's new companion was frightening, loud, and erratic. Yet Vanessa seemed entranced, as if she had fallen under a spell. Russo spoke openly about Thomas, boasting to friends that he could intimidate him. He once told an associate, "She will have everything once he is gone, and so will I." Those chilling words would later be described by investigators not as idle threats, but as a blueprint for murder. On the night of September 22, 2001, Thomas was alone in his East Hampton estate. It was a quiet evening, and the mansion that had once hosted dazzling parties now stood still and silent. At some point during the night, an intruder entered. The attack was savage. Thomas was struck repeatedly with a blunt object, beaten with such force that investigators later called it an act driven by rage. There were no signs of forced entry. This detail suggested the killer either had a key or was willingly let inside. When Thomas' body was discovered, shock rippled through the Hamptons. The brutal death of one of New York's most successful financiers inside his own home shattered the illusion of wealth and safety. Detectives immediately turned their focus toward Michael Russo. His affair with Vanessa was no secret, and his criminal history made him an obvious suspect. As investigators pieced together the night of the crime, they found Russo's alibi was weak and full of holes. Phone records placed him near the estate. Witnesses recalled his threats. Every clue tightened the noose around him. The motive seemed clear: eliminate Thomas and open the way to Vanessa's fortune. Yet one question lingered. Was Vanessa simply a grieving widow caught in scandal, or had she quietly pushed Russo toward murder? When the case reached court, it became a spectacle. The murder of Thomas Albright was not just another crime. It was a tale of power, betrayal, and lust played out under the bright glare of the media. Prosecutors painted Russo as a jealous and greedy lover who saw Thomas as an obstacle to a life of luxury. They presented witnesses who testified that Russo bragged about getting rid of Thomas. They reminded the jury of his violent temper and his reckless behavior. The brutality of the killing, they argued, was fueled by a toxic mix of greed and rage. Vanessa's role was never fully proven, but her shadow loomed large over the trial. Prosecutors suggested she had manipulated Russo, knowing he was capable of violence. Her cold demeanor in the courtroom made the public suspicious. Margaret Collins, Thomas's sister, delivered one of the most heartbreaking testimonies. She spoke of David and Emily and how they had lost both parents that night, one to murder, the other to betrayal. Her words left the courtroom silent. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict. Michael Russo was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. For a brief moment, it seemed justice had been served. But the tragedy did not end there. In 2003, Vanessa Hale lost her battle with cancer. Her death left David and Emily as orphans, carrying the burden of a name tied forever to scandal and betrayal. The Hamptons mansion, once a place of beauty and status, became infamous. Neighbors whispered about it as the cursed house, a reminder of how quickly glamour could dissolve into horror. Journalists and filmmakers returned to the story again and again. Some portrayed Vanessa as a victim drawn into the orbit of a dangerous man. Others argued she had orchestrated the tragedy from behind the scenes. Detectives themselves admitted that lingering questions still haunted them. The murder weapon was never firmly identified. The lack of forced entry raised suspicions that only someone close to Thomas could have granted Russo access. The debate over Vanessa's role ensured the case never truly found closure. Michael Russo remained in prison, insisting he was used and betrayed, claiming that Vanessa had pulled the strings. His words convinced few, but they fueled speculation and kept the story alive in the public imagination. For David and Emily, the weight of the past never lifted. Their childhood was marked by tabloid headlines, hushed whispers, and the haunting truth that both their parents were gone in the span of just 2 years. The years after the trial brought no peace for the Albright family. Though Michael Russo sat behind bars, the questions that surrounded the case refused to fade. Vanessa's name appeared in every book, article, and television documentary about the murder, each portrayal different and conflicting. Some painted her as a victim of circumstance, trapped between an unfaithful marriage and a violent lover. Others insisted she was the architect of the betrayal, quietly guiding Russo to carry out the unthinkable. The public fascination only grew as time passed. Producers dramatized the crime for late-night television, reenacting the stormy marriage and the bloody night in the Hamptons mansion. True crime authors filled pages with theories, timelines, and psychological profiles. Every detail from the Albright art collection to the clothes Vanessa wore in court became part of the mythology of the case. The mansion itself stood as a ghost of its past. Families that moved in tried to repaint, remodel, and erase the memory of the killing, but whispers followed every new owner. Locals would pause outside its gates, telling visitors this is where Thomas Albright was murdered. Children dared each other to step onto the driveway at night. The estate, once a symbol of wealth and security, became a monument to betrayal. Meanwhile, David and Emily grew older, trying to find normal lives beyond the shadow of their parents' tragedy. Reporters chased them for interviews, but they stayed silent. Friends who knew them later described them as quiet, withdrawn, careful not to let anyone too close. It was as if they carried an invisible wall between themselves and the world around them. Yet the legacy could not be escaped. Their names always carried the weight of their father's success and their mother's scandal. For detectives who had worked the original case, the memories never faded either. Retired officers admitted that unanswered questions still woke them at night. How had Russo gained entry so easily? Had Vanessa truly given him the means? Why had she stayed so close to him in the weeks before the murder, despite knowing his violent past? Those questions lingered like smoke, refusing to clear. Inside prison, Russo built a reputation of his own. He was defiant and unpredictable, prone to outbursts and fights. When interviewed by journalists, he repeated the same claim over and over. "I was used. She wanted him gone. She knew what would happen." His words rarely changed, but the tone shifted with the years, at times bitter, at times broken, as though even he no longer understood where his choices had led him. Outside the prison walls, the fascination never ended. Law schools studied the trial as a lesson in circumstantial evidence and testimony. Psychologists wrote papers analyzing the bond between Vanessa and Russo, the dangerous pull between control and submission, love and destruction. The story of the Hamptons Betrayal was no longer just a crime. It became a parable about human weakness, about how wealth, beauty, and status could not protect a family from ruin. Over the years, the story of Thomas Albright's murder began to take on a life of its own. In the Hamptons, it was whispered at dinner parties and charity galas, always spoken with lowered voices, as though the walls themselves remembered. In New York, it became a cautionary tale, shared among financiers who knew Thomas as a brilliant mind, but also as a man blinded by his own pride. The betrayal became a mirror that reflected the fears of the wealthy, that even within their grand estates, danger could be waiting at the door. For Vanessa, the image that survived was as fractured as her marriage had once been. To some, she was a grieving widow, unfairly tied to a crime she never committed. To others, she was a calculating woman who chose passion and escape over loyalty and honor. Her battle with illness only deepened the mystery, as she never gave a final word or confession. Her silence left room for endless speculation, and every silence became an answer in itself. David and Emily grew into adulthood carrying a burden they never asked for. They avoided reporters and refused book deals, turning down the chance to profit from their tragedy. Yet no matter how far they tried to move, the weight of the Hamptons betrayal followed them like a shadow. Friends who managed to get close said they rarely spoke of their parents, but when they did, the tone was heavy with pain and distance. The image of their father, successful and commanding, was forever tainted by the horror of his death. The memory of their mother, warm at times, cold at others, was complicated by the choices she made and the man she allowed into their lives. In courtrooms across the country, law professors referenced the trial of Michael Russo to illustrate how motive, opportunity, and circumstantial evidence could build a case strong enough to secure conviction. Students listened with fascination, some seeing Russo as a reckless criminal, others wondering if he was only half of a darker story. Documentaries replayed the grainy footage of him in handcuffs, his head bowed, his face unreadable. Even in stillness, he seemed to radiate danger. The Hamptons mansion itself remained a symbol. In every retelling, it appeared in glossy magazine spreads before the murder as a beacon of wealth, and after the murder as a symbol of decay.
Every attempt to sell it was accompanied by curiosity seekers who drove past slowly, pointing to the windows as if expecting to see the past still alive within. No renovation, no fresh paint, no fresh landscaping could erase what had happened there. It was more than just a house. It was the stage upon which love, power, and betrayal had collided with deadly force. And still the story grew. Each decade brought new retellings and new theories. Each generation of readers and viewers found something different in it. For some, it was a crime story. For others, a family tragedy. And for others still, a lesson about how easily desire and anger can destroy everything built over a lifetime.
Journalists continued to revisit the story, chasing every whisper of new information. Some claimed that hidden letters existed between Vanessa and Russo, letters that hinted at a deeper conspiracy than anyone had proven in court. Others insisted that Thomas himself had secrets, financial dealings, and personal liaisons that might have provided other motives for his death. Each new claim kept the case alive, fueling debates about whether justice had truly been served or whether pieces of the truth had been buried beneath wealth and influence. Detectives who once walked the halls of the Albright mansion remembered the eerie silence of the crime scene. They spoke of the scent of expensive wood and polish, mingling with the metallic edge of blood, a contrast so stark it stayed with them for years. Some admitted privately that they believed the story was incomplete, that too many threads had been left hanging, too many questions unanswered. David and Emily carried those questions as well, though they never spoke of them publicly. In their teenage years, they were guarded, watched by relatives who tried to shield them from the world outside. But as they grew older, the silence became its own prison. They were children of wealth, yet robbed of security, heirs to a fortune, yet stripped of a home. Their lives became a quiet rebellion against the past. They avoided the Hamptons, they avoided Wall Street, they avoided everything that tied them back to the night when their family fractured forever. Yet despite their attempts to move forward, the world would not let go. Strangers approached them in restaurants with sympathy or curiosity, sometimes both. Reporters trailed them at airports, snapping pictures that would later appear in gossip magazines, under headlines about the cursed heirs of the Hamptons. It was a weight that could not be shaken, a shadow that stretched far beyond the walls of the mansion. Meanwhile, inside prison, Michael Russo grew older but not quieter. He gave interviews to small-time writers and documentary crews, spinning his version of events. He insisted that Vanessa had promised him a life of luxury, that she whispered about freedom from Thomas, that she painted visions of a new beginning. But with each retelling, his story shifted, leaving listeners unsure of what was truth and what was a desperate man rewriting his past. Still, his words kept Vanessa's name alive in the conversation. Even in death, she was part of the scandal, an enigma who could not defend herself, yet whose silence seemed to speak louder than any confession. The Hamptons' betrayal became more than a crime. It became a myth, a story, passed down with the cadence of legend, whispered by firelight, retold in classrooms, dramatized on screens. It was the tale of a man who built an empire, a woman who felt trapped inside it, and a lover who brought it crashing down. And for those who lived through it, for those who lost family, friends, or peace of mind, it was not just a story. It was life, forever marked by betrayal.
As the years stretched on, the mansion stood like a scar on the landscape of the Hamptons. Wealthy families came and went, trying to reclaim it as a place of beauty, but the history clung to every wall. Local children dared one another to sneak up the long driveway, whispering about the ghost of Thomas Albright, said to walk the halls at night. Tourists drove past slowly, their cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the house that had seen so much blood and betrayal. The community itself never forgot. Older residents shared memories of the trial, recalling how the quiet lanes of East Hampton were overrun by news vans and reporters broadcasting to the world. They remembered the frenzy, the whispered rumors, and the sense that their small town had been forever altered by a single act of violence. For David and Emily, the house was more than cursed. It was a wound that never healed. They refused to set foot near it, and when asked about the mansion, their answers were brief and cold, as though speaking its name alone might open old pain. But no matter how far they traveled, their past followed. At universities, classmates recognized their last name and asked cautious questions about their parents. At work, their resumes carried the weight of history, every employer aware of the story that shadowed them. They built lives quietly, carefully, yet the world always pulled them back into the tragedy they never chose. Meanwhile, inside the prison walls, Michael Russo aged into a man almost unrecognizable from the brash figure who once swaggered through Vanessa life. His hair turned gray, his shoulders stooped, yet his temper remained. Reports spoke of fights, arguments, and solitary confinement. Still, when he was interviewed, he leaned forward with the same fire, insisting that he had not acted alone, insisting that Vanessa was as guilty as he was. Those words kept the fire burning outside the prison walls. Every few years a new book appeared. Every few years a documentary aired, each one presenting a different angle on the betrayal. Some painted Russo as a monster, others painted him as a pawn. Some cast Vanessa as a tragic figure, others as a mastermind. The story shifted with every retelling, but its hold never weakened. The Hamptons betrayal had become more than an event. It had become a legend. A story about love twisted into obsession, about power corroded by resentment, about wealth unable to shield a family from ruin. And with every whisper, every retelling, the questions remain alive. What truly happened on that September night inside the mansion? Who held the most blame for the fall of the Albright family? And how much of the truth still lay buried beneath silence and shadows?
As the decades passed, the fascination with the Hamptons betrayal only deepened. New generations discovered the story through streaming documentaries, podcasts, and magazine retrospectives. Each production layered the tale with fresh speculation and dramatic narration, keeping the tragedy alive in the public imagination. Detectives, long retired, appeared on camera, their faces lined with age, yet their voices carrying the same certainty that had guided them years earlier. Some swore that Michael Russo acted entirely on his own, driven by rage and greed. Others admitted that too many details never quite fit, that Vanessa's presence in the background could not be ignored, even if the evidence never placed her hands on the weapon. The lack of closure kept the public hooked. In lecture halls, criminologists dissected the case as a study in motive and manipulation. They asked their students to consider the triangle of Thomas, Vanessa, and Russo: a wealthy husband, a discontented wife, and a volatile lover. It was a triangle that seemed destined for collapse, and when it did, the fallout destroyed more than just 3 lives. David and Emily became adults, marked by whispers they never escaped. At business meetings, their last name drew stares. At social gatherings, questions lingered in the air, unspoken, yet heavy.
They avoided interviews, turned down offers for book deals, and declined every request for comment from filmmakers. Silence became their only defense against a world that refused to let go of their parents' sins. Yet, silence did not erase the pain. Friends noticed the weight in their eyes, the guarded way they navigated relationships, as though afraid that trust itself could be a weapon. The mansion continued to loom in the background of their lives, even when they lived thousands of miles away. It was photographed endlessly, each new owner unable to erase its haunted past. Some buyers tore down walls, others built new wings, but the foundation itself seemed cursed, a reminder that beauty and wealth could not conceal darkness forever. Meanwhile, Michael Russo remained in prison, his body weakened by time, but his voice still sharp. He spoke to anyone willing to listen, repeating that Vanessa had led him down the path that ruined them both. Sometimes he claimed she planned every detail. Other times he insisted she whispered suggestions and let him do the rest. His story shifted, but his bitterness never faded. And those contradictions only fueled more speculation. Writers latched on to his interviews, building new theories around every word. Some saw him as delusional, a man rewriting history to save his pride. Others wondered if his fractured accounts hid slivers of truth waiting to be pieced together. The Hamptons Betrayal refused to fade into history. It remained alive in classrooms, in documentaries, in hushed conversations at dinner parties, and in the quiet grief of two children who had grown up carrying its weight. And still, the central question lingered. Was the story of Thomas Albright's murder fully told, or was part of the truth still buried beneath silence, lies, and shadows?
In the end, the Hamptons Betrayal became more than a crime. It became a parable. The mansion that once stood as a monument to wealth and privilege was finally sold and stripped of its former grandeur, its gardens untended, its halls empty, its reputation forever scarred. It stood not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of how quickly everything could collapse. Michael Russo spent the rest of his days behind bars, his health failing until the fire in his voice finally dimmed and silence claimed him. His passing made only a small headline, but for those who remembered the trial, it felt like the last echo of a storm that had once consumed the Hamptons. Vanessa's name lingered in speculation, but her absence left no answers, only shadows that deepened over time. For David and Emily, the years slowly brought distance from the scandal, though the weight of their past never truly disappeared. They learned to live with it, to carry it quietly, like a scar that could not be erased. They found strength not in the legacy of wealth or reputation, but in the quiet determination to survive and to build something of their own. The story of Thomas Albright's murder faded from the front pages, but it never left the whispers of the Hamptons. It lived on in cautionary tales told to strangers in the dark, in the hushed tones of those who remembered, and in the legends of a community forever marked by betrayal. And though time moved forward, the questions remained unanswered, the truth forever tangled in silence, rage, and secrecy. The Hamptons Betrayal closed not with resolution, but with mystery, a story that ended as it began, with wealth, love, and lies colliding in a storm that could never be undone.